Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. Today, we're going to be taking a close look at the case of Derek Bird,
Oh, yeah.
the taxi driver, who went on a shooting rampage across Cumbria back in 2010.
Yeah, this case, this one really shook people up. I mean, you have this seemingly ordinary guy who suddenly commits these horrific acts.
Right, and it all began on June 2nd.
Yes, June 2nd, 2010.
Okay.
It started with Bird killing his twin brother, David, and then he went after his family solicitor, Kevin Commons.
Yeah, you'd think there would have been some huge fight or a bad falling out leading up to that, especially with his own brother.
Right.
But the family has said that, their relationship was actually pretty good. David even helped Derek out quite a bit.
Exactly. That's one of the things that makes this case so puzzling. But, as the investigation unfolded, we learned that Bird had been struggling with a lot of anxieties and unfounded fears, especially about money. He had this fixed idea that his brother and solicitor were working against him, maybe fueled by the fact that he was under investigation for tax evasion.
Ah, so the tax issue comes into play.
Yeah.
The sources mentioned that Bird had a substantial amount of undeclared cash, around 60,000 pounds tucked away. And it sounds like the thought of going to prison for that really pushed him over the edge.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that Bird's solicitor had assured him he could handle any potential fines, but for some reason those reassurances didn't get through to Bird, or maybe he just refused to believe them.
So it seems like Bird was living in this world of paranoia and suspicion, and that twisted thinking ultimately led him to commit these terrible acts.
Yeah, after killing his brother and solicitor, Bird set off on a terrifying journey across Cumbria, shooting people seemingly at random as he went.
And this wasn't just a quick spree, was it? The attacks spanned a significant distance.
Absolutely. It covered about 15 miles of the Cumbrian coastline, hitting towns like Whitehaven, Egremont, Gosforth, and Seascale. Witnesses described scenes of absolute panic as Bird drove through these usually peaceful towns, firing his weapons with no apparent regard for who got in his way.
What's truly frightening is that Bird used his knowledge of back roads to evade capture for a while, adding to the chaos and making it harder for the police to respond effectively.
Yeah, let's talk about the police response, because there were both successes and shortcomings. One of the initial challenges was that early reports described Bird's weapon as an air rifle. This probably led to a delay in deploying armed officers, as an air rifle doesn't carry the same immediate threat as a shotgun or rifle.
Right, that detail about the air rifle is crucial.
Yeah.
It really underscores how vital accurate information is in these kinds of high-pressure situations where every minute can make a difference.
Right. But the police also did some things well. They used a variety of ways to alert the public announcements on the radio and their website messages from the police helicopter, even stopwatch radio links.
It sounds like those efforts paid off. Bird drove through several areas that are normally packed with tourists, but they were deserted because of the warnings. It's safe to say that a lot of lives were saved because of those actions.
Yeah, there's a particularly harrowing account from the fire crew in Seascale. They found themselves right in the middle of the rampage trying to treat a gunshot victim while Bird was still out there.
Wow, that really shows the incredible courage of those first responders. They're often thrust into these incredibly dangerous and unpredictable situations, yet they still put themselves on the line to help others.
Yeah, Seascale also turned out to be where Bird's spree came to an end. He shot 2 more people there, Michael Pike and Jane Robinson, both of whom sadly died.
The details of those last shootings are really disturbing. Pike, a 64-year-old man, was just out riding his bike when Bird shot him at point-blank range, and Robinson, a 66-year-old woman, was delivering catalogs and suffered the same fate.
It's a stark reminder that these were ordinary people living ordinary lives who were suddenly caught up in this horrific event.
After Seascale, Bird headed towards the Escadale Valley with a helicopter and officers from the Civil Nuclear Constabulary. Remember, this was happening near the Sellafield nuclear plant? The police finally closed in on him.
It turned out to be the largest mobilization of armed police in Cumbria's history. It must have been incredibly tense, but they eventually found Bird's abandoned car.
And that discovery was key. They found his rifle and sound moderator nearby, so they knew he was likely on foot and still armed.
Right. Fearing he might try to take hostages or hurt someone else, the police immediately started searching the nearby woodland.
And it was during that search, just a short while later, that they found Bird's body. He had taken his own life. What a truly horrifying end to a day filled with senseless violence.
The aftermath of the Cumbria shootings was one of shock, grief, and a profound sense of loss for these close-knit communities. The ripple effect of Bird's actions was immense.
And think about the added trauma for the first responders and witnesses, many of whom knew the victims personally. It speaks volumes about the resilience of these communities. but it also highlights the deep wounds left behind by this tragedy.
Now let's dig a bit deeper into what we know about Bird's actions and the events leading up to that day. What's striking is that there seems to be a combination of meticulous planning alongside seemingly impulsive acts of violence. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment rampage. Bird had clearly thought about this and prepared for it.
What kind of preparation are we talking about?
Well, Bird had a shotgun certificate since 1974 and a firearms certificate for a rifle. But sometime before the attacks, he illegally shortened the barrel of his shotgun.
What difference does that make?
Shortening the barrel makes the weapon easier to hide and handle, but it also increases the spread of the shot, making it even more deadly at close range.
That suggests he was anticipating close quarters confrontations, which adds another layer of disturbing calculation to his actions.
And that's not all. The police later found hundreds of rounds of ammunition at Bird's home. This underlines his level of preparation and suggests that the potential for carnage was even greater than what actually occurred.
The fact that he carried out these attacks in broad daylight, driving through busy towns, also speaks to a desire to inflict maximum terror and disruption.
That's a recurring theme we see in these kinds of cases. It's not just about harming people. There's also a twisted desire to shock and destabilize, to exert a warped sense of power and control over others.
The psychological side of this case is really fascinating. If horrifying experts have been trying to piece together what drove Bird to commit these acts, but there's no easy answer.
That's one of the most challenging aspects of trying to understand these events. We can analyze the evidence, look for patterns and possible explanations, but the human mind is a complex thing capable of both great compassion and unimaginable darkness.
Absolutely, and the impact on these communities, especially given how tightly knit they are, can't be overstated.
One of the things that really hit me was that many of those first responders and witnesses had personal connections to the victims. That adds another layer of trauma to an already horrific situation.
It's a testament to the strength and resilience of those communities, but also a reminder of the deep scars left behind by this kind of tragedy.
And it raises a lot of questions, doesn't it, about mental health awareness, especially in areas where access to support might be limited.
You're right, the Cumbria shootings serve as a stark reminder of how important it is to recognize the warning signs and to create a culture where people feel comfortable seeking help when they need it.
Let's talk more about those warning signs and missed opportunities in part 2. There's a lot to unpack there, especially about Bird's deteriorating mental state and whether those around him could have done more to intervene. One of the most disturbing things about this case is how it challenges our understanding of violence. Bird wasn't a stranger to his victims. He was a part of their community. He knew the roads, the people, even the routines of daily life in Cumbria. That familiarity makes his actions all the more unsettling.
It's almost as if the violence was woven into the fabric of a place that most people considered safe and familiar, that makes it even harder to comprehend.
You're absolutely right. And going back to the warning signs we were just discussing, the most heartbreaking aspects is the recurring theme of missed opportunities. It's clear that Bird's mental state was deteriorating, but those closest to him, family, friends, either didn't grasp how serious it was or felt helpless to intervene.
It's a tragic reminder that we often struggle to recognize and address mental health issues, especially when it comes to men. There's still a stigma around men expressing their emotions or seeking help.
Precisely. Men are often conditioned to keep their feelings bottled up, to tough it out, and that can have disastrous consequences. We need to foster an environment where mental health is treated with the same urgency and compassion as physical health, regardless of gender.
One of the recommendations from the peer review of the police response was the implementation of a system that would track firearms licenses and flag any potential mental health concerns. That seems like a logical step to take.
It is, and it's a reminder that preventing tragedies like this requires a multifaceted approach. We need systems in place to identify potential risks, but we also need to shift societal attitudes towards mental health. People need to feel safe, seeking help without fear of judgment or repercussions.
You've mentioned eyewitness accounts a few times. What kind of insights do those offer? What was it like to be in the midst of this terrifying event?
The eyewitness accounts are truly harrowing. They paint a picture of utter chaos and fear as Bird moved from town to town. Imagine hearing gunshots in your quiet neighborhood, seeing a car speeding by, and then realizing that a man is randomly shooting people. That's the reality those witnesses faced.
Were there any accounts that stood out to you?
One that particularly struck me was the story of Darren Williamson, a former Marine commando who was in Whitehaven that day. He heard the shots, saw Bird running through the town with his shotgun, and described him as looking for someone That chilling detail reinforces the sense of premeditation and malice in Bird's actions.
So it wasn't just random firing. Bird was actively seeking out victims.
That's right. And then there's Paul Goodwin's account. He and a police officer were chasing Bird in Whitehaven. But despite being pursued, Bird stopped his car and calmly shot at another taxi driver. It shows a level of audacity and disregard for the law that's truly unsettling.
What about the victims themselves? Their stories are at the heart of this tragedy.
Yes, it's so important to remember that these were real people with lives, families, and dreams. One of the sources included a statement from David Bowden, the chairman of Gary Purdum's rugby club. He described Purdum as a gentleman, and a pleasure to know Purdum was simply working in a field when Bird took his life.
It's a heartbreaking reminder that these were ordinary people going about their day, caught in the crosshairs of someone else's rage and despair.
Another poignant story is that of Michael Pike. His neighbor described him as a people person who always went out of his way to help others. His death left a huge void in the community.
The ripple effect of this kind of tragedy is immeasurable.
And the emotional toll on the community doesn't stop there. Remember, this happened in West Cumbria, a region known for its strong community bonds and sense of tranquility. The fact that the perpetrator was one of their own, someone familiar, makes it even more difficult to process.
It shatters that sense of security and trust that often defines these close-knit communities.
Exactly. And the media coverage, while necessary to inform the public, also plays a role in shaping how we perceive these events. The Cumbria shootings received extensive attention both nationally and internationally, and it's crucial that we consider the potential impact of such coverage.
What are some of the things we need to be mindful of?
Sensationalism is always a concern. The media has a responsibility to report accurately and ethically without exploiting the tragedy or glorifying the perpetrator. We also need to be aware of the potential for copycat attacks. The way we portray violence in the media can have a ripple effect, influencing the actions of others who might be susceptible to such influence.
So it's not just about consuming the news passively. We need to engage with it critically, be aware of the potential biases and agendas, and consider the broader context.
You're absolutely right. And as we continue to examine this case, it's essential to remember that behind the headlines and the statistics are real people, real lives forever changed. It's their stories that truly matter, and it's their loss that we must never forget.
You've touched on the police response a few times. What are some of the key takeaways from the peer review? What lessons can we learn from how law enforcement handled this situation?
The peer review is really insightful. It doesn't shy away from the challenges the police faced, particularly in a rural area with limited resources. One of the biggest issues was the initial confusion over the type of weapon Bird was using, the delay in deploying armed officers. Because of that, inaccurate information could have had tragic consequences.
It emphasizes how critical clear communication and accurate information are in these rapidly evolving situations.
Absolutely. But the review also acknowledges the bravery and professionalism of the officers involved, many of whom went above and beyond the call of duty to protect their community.
It sounds like a complex and nuanced assessment.
It is, and it underscores the need for ongoing training and preparedness. Active shooter situations are thankfully rare, but law enforcement needs to be ready to respond effectively when they do occur. The Cumbria shootings provide valuable lessons about the importance of coordination, communication, and having the right resources in place to handle such crises.
This case brings up so many important points about mental health, gun control, and the role of the media in covering these types of tragedies. It's a lot to process.
You know, one thing that keeps coming back to me as we talk about this case is the sheer randomness of it all. So many of Bird's victims were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, it's a stark reminder of how vulnerable we all are, how life can change in an instant.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point. It strips away any illusion of control we might have and forces us to confront the fragility of life.
Exactly. And it raises questions about how we cope with that sense of vulnerability, how we make sense of such senseless acts. The Cumbria shootings weren't just about the victims and their families. They impacted the entire community, leaving a lasting scar on the region's psyche.
Yeah, the sources mention that many people in Cumbria struggled with feelings of guilt and anger in the aftermath. Even those who weren't directly affected felt a sense of responsibility, questioning whether they could have done anything to prevent this tragedy.
That's a natural response to trauma, that search for meaning, for something to hold on to in the face of such a devastating event. And it speaks to the importance of community support, of coming together to share the burden of grief and to find ways to heal.
You've talked about the importance of learning from this tragedy.
Yeah.
What are some of the key lessons that we should take away from the Cumbria shootings?
Well, on a practical level, there are certainly lessons for law enforcement about preparedness communication and the need for effective systems to identify potential threats. The peer review highlighted some areas where improvements could be made, and those recommendations should be taken seriously. But beyond that, I think the Cumbria shootings force us to grapple with some bigger questions about mental health, about gun control, and about the kind of society we want to live in.
Those are complex issues with no easy answers.
They are, but they're issues we can't afford to ignore. We need to have honest conversations about mental health stigma, about access to resources, and about the warning signs that often go unnoticed. We need to consider what more we can do to prevent individuals who are struggling from falling through the cracks.
And what about the issue of gun control? It's always a contentious topic, especially in a country like the UK, where gun ownership is already tightly regulated.
It is, but the Cumbria shootings brought the issue back into sharp focus. Byrd was a licensed gun owner, but he still managed to modify his weapons illegally and carry out this horrific attack. It raises questions about whether current regulations are sufficient, whether there are gaps that need to be addressed to prevent similar tragedies in the future.
It's a debate that deserves thoughtful consideration, weighing the rights of responsible gun owners against the need to protect public safety. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but we can't shy away from having these difficult conversations.
You're absolutely right. And as we reflect on the Cumbria shootings, I think it's also important to remember that these kinds of events, while horrific, are thankfully rare. It's easy to get caught up in the fear and the headlines, but we shouldn't let that overshadow the everyday acts of kindness and compassion that define our communities.
That's an important reminder. We need to hold on to hope, to believe that we can learn from these tragedies and work towards creating a safer, more compassionate world. It's what the victims and their families deserve.
You know, in many ways, the Cumbria shootings are a story about contrasts the idyllic setting of the Lake District juxtaposed with the brutality of the crimes, the normalcy of everyday life shattered by a sudden eruption of violence, the resilience of the community grappling with profound loss. It's a story that stays with you, that challenges you to confront uncomfortable truths about the human capacity for both good and evil.
And it's a story that, despite its darkness, reminds us of the importance of connection, of reaching out to those who are struggling, and of cherishing the preciousness of life.
This is a truly disturbing case for Simon and Tom to talk about in their weekly review show on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.